Hello, good afternoon or evening as the case may be. Welcome to this week's Global Christian Perspectives with me, Chris Eyre. Joining me tonight is Allan Bevere and Tony Mitchell. Hopefully joining us later is going to be Elgin Hushbeck. Number of items came up, and one, as we obviously have to mention elections at some point. Allan, you put in a couple of links about election demographics changing. Would you like to expand on that a bit?
Well, yeah, demographics is something that's interested me for some time, not just in the area of politics, but in religion and other places, and how that affects the present and the future. And there certainly is a shift in demographics going on in the United States. The projections are that by 2050, there will be no discernible ethnic majority in the United States. And that certainly is going to, at least over the next decade or two, I think affect the politics of elections as the electorate becomes more diverse. And therefore, as both political parties in our system, we'll have to work to appeal to that diversity over time if they want to win elections. And I just think it's interesting to ask that question as to how the changing demographics. Not to mention as the baby boomers now are retiring, and as in the next couple of decades they'll begin to die off, and you've got these young millennials whose views tend not to necessarily, certainly for the most part, or at least to a lesser extent, tend to be less conservative, at least at this point, than their grandparents. You know, how does this over time affect elections? And that's just simply the interest that I have in calling attention to this article.
Are you expecting it to produce a big swing towards more radical or left-wing or, dare I say it, socialist policy?
I tend to think not. I tend in American politics, and again, obviously, predictions are. If I could predict things, I would have written several books, and I'd be retired right now, sitting on the beach somewhere in the South. But it seems to me that I don't know that we'll get these radical kinds of swings either one way or another. I do think, right at the moment, you're seeing with the supporters of Donald Trump and the supporters of Bernie Sanders. I think you're seeing a dis-ease or a disquiet with quote-unquote, as they have said, establishment politics. But you know, the reality is, and I think this cuts across ethnic groups, is the more prosperous any group of people in a country become, the more economically prosperous they become, the more they become at least economically conservative, because they want to kind of hang on to what they've got. So I don't know that I see extremes taking place, but I do see, at least for the next couple election cycles, a swing a little bit to the left. But I'm not sure how that plays out in the election. I have to say I'm somewhat baffled by, I mean, even though I understand it, I'm somewhat baffled by this election. There's things happening that I would have not thought of 4 years ago.
Okay. If I can sort of draw a parallel with what has happened here recently. In our last election, we had an uncommonly good showing of a party called the UK Independence Party, led by a populist guy called Nigel Farage, who is about as close as we are ever likely to get to Donald Trump. He's not nearly as far out as Donald Trump, but similar kind of approach, and he is very much for a little England, let's get rid of the Europeans outlook. On the other side, the Labour Party have managed to elect themselves a leader who is actually a socialist again for the first time in something like 30 years. So both of those are, to a great extent, against the establishment status quo. And we had Margaret Thatcher, followed on by Tony Blair, who a lot of people thought of as being Thatcher light, rather than a man of the left, which is what the Labour Party previously were. And I can see parallels with Clinton Obama being pretty much corporatist, pretty much in favour of big business, which I might not have expected a left party to be, following on Reagan in the States. So I can maybe see some parallels, and basically people getting fed up of same old with a little badge engineering.
Yeah. You know, what's interesting to me is that there certainly is an isolationist tendency with Trump supporters, and I think the Republicans are partly responsible for that with the Iraq War and some of the other things. What's real interesting to me, however, is that my suspicion is, and it's just a suspicion, I don't have any evidence to demonstrate it, but it is a suspicion of mine that these people now who are supporting Trump, who are moving toward these isolationist tendencies, are many of them are the same people who supported the Iraq War, and so that in some ways they kind of had enough of an activist international politics. So when Trump says Japan needs to have nuclear weapons and South Korea needs to have nuclear weapons and it's time they did their own thing and we need to quit paying for all this, I think that resonates with these supporters who now have, I guess, moved toward that isolationist perspective. It's just some thoughts on my part. I don't know.
Oh, well, welcome, Elgin.
Welcome. Nice to finally get here.
Well done. We started with Allan's item from a couple of weeks back on changing demographics and elections, and we've got into the feeling that there's been a reaction in both directions against the establishment generally, which you might sympathise with, Elgin.
Yeah, I would. You know, depending on the particular details, I do believe there's been an estrangement of politicians in Washington, in particular, from the populace as a whole. And I think there you see that on both parties. I would disagree slightly with Allan's assessment of the Iraq War in terms of driving people away, because I think at least with Trump supporters, there's probably some truth there, but with Trump supporters, they seem to be pulling in people that had not participated before, that had sort of given up on politics or had never even participated in the first place, and so he's pulling people into the system that wouldn't have been participating earlier on. But regardless of where those are coming from, I do think there's a great deal of anger in the country. Everyone's pretty much agreed that Washington is not working. There's probably a lot of disagreement on why, but in general, this agreement is not working. And I think you see that in the candidacies of both Trump and Cruz and Sanders.
Okay. Do you see the release of the Panama Papers recently as feeding into this? I do notice that it's taken down the Iceland Prime Minister. David Cameron's is on the back foot because his family has been named in there, his father particularly. I don't know how many of the U.S. establishment might be implicated there.
Well, the last time I saw that, they hadn't actually reported any connection to America. I don't think that's going to last. I think there obviously will be some. So I think at this point it's too new, and there's 11 million documents they have to go through. It's going to take them a while.
I was going to say the document size is too big for they started at the top and worked their way through, and but what I was going to say, perhaps I'm going to be slightly contrarian. The protest vote, I agree with everybody that there is a protest vote this year, but I also think, and this goes into the Panama Papers issue, the presence of big money in American elections and perhaps in British elections and other elections is driving more voters away. Now, what's going on with the Republican Party, I think the Republican Party is going to die after this election. Or if not, it's going to be 1968 for the Republicans this year, where the infighting goes, well, the term would be viral, and they have to rebuild. What I think is going to happen is there's going to be a return to grassroots organization. And that's what happened. That's what happened to the Republicans in '64. They got totally devastated nationally. They went back to grassroots, and they're seeing the reflection of that, much to my own personal disbelief.
Yeah.
I'm not too crazy about what's going on at the local level in a variety of states, but I think that's what's going to happen. The two national parties have played out. There's going to be a whole new set of grassroots organization. We're not going to see it we're not going to see it nationally for 2 or 3 cycles. And the vote, the November vote, I don't know how that's going to play out. Maybe one of the largest turnouts we've ever had. That's my take on and if there are Americans in the Panama Papers, it's just going to reinforce the idea that the rich, the rich don't want to share.
Absolutely. I gather that top of the heap for a number of people involved is Hong Kong, closely followed by the UK, and the United States comes in third. But I don't know about any well-known names from the States at the moment.
I was sort of surprised by the Iceland Prime Minister resigning, or as he said, step aside for the moment.
Of course.
Well,
like no candidate ever drops out of the primary. They only suspend their campaign temporarily.
on the other hand, they prosecuted bankers for the banking crash.
That's why I was surprised by the Iceland, because Iceland went after the bankers.
Yeah, well, they seem to be taking the moral high ground generally at the moment, which I can't criticise too much. All right, if I can move on from there, I came up with an item regarding free trade agreements, the Mexicanization of the United States a while ago, and had myself a little rant about them. I think, Allan, you're actually quite keen on free trade agreements in principle.
Well, I don't know that I'm keen. I mean, I do think. Yeah, I guess I probably lean toward free trade. I don't think it should be unregulated trade.
Mm-hmm.
But I think sometimes, usually at least the arguments that I hear against free trade usually are picking out certain sectors that have seemed not to have done well, and forgetting the sectors that have done very well in reference to free trade. I'm mindful. I remember President Truman saying when he was president that he could never find a one-arm economist, and meaning by that is that everybody he consulted in reference to economic decisions was, well, if you do this, here's the upside, but there's also a downside. It just seems to me that so often economics is a trade-off. Right now, oil is cheaper, so that benefits the consumer. that benefits other people. But having a son-in-law who works in the energy industry, I can tell you that there are people who a lot of people have either lost their jobs because of that, or they're working a lot more hours, taking on a lot more hours in order to keep their job. And so there have been some really good jobs that have been lost because of that. So I'm not so sure that the answer always is simply to find a way to just regulate. The other issue with trade, and I'll just mention this one other thing, is I'm not sure how you ultimately fix a trade deficit when you are trading with countries whose cost of living is so much cheaper, who can produce goods more cheaply than we can, and when we have people who have higher wages. I mean, ultimately, I certainly am in favor of trying to narrow the gap, but ultimately how you get rid of the trade gap, when people can live on a fraction, people live in China on a fraction of what we live on in the United States. I'm not sure what you do about that. And I'm speaking here, by the way, as an amateur. I'm certainly no economist. It's just what I perceive.
Mm-hmm. Elgin, you're generally quite big on economics. What's your feeling?
I am also in favor of mildly regulated trade, shall we put it. Generally in free trade, ideally everything would be free trade. There are some concerns that I think need to be addressed, such as exploiting workers to a great extent, or pollution issues in a great extent that tilt the balance one way or the other. But in the general principle, I mean, for example, between equal states like, say, Canada and United States, or Europe and the United States, I think we should have free trade. It gets a little more problematic when you go to China or third world countries, but I think we have a vested interest in encouraging that, because yes, they're going to get paid extremely low wages compared to what we would pay here in the United States. On the other hand, we are basically providing jobs to people that otherwise wouldn't have them, and allowing them to develop economically. I mean, for a long time we had this issue with Japan importing cheap goods, and because their labor rates were so much less, but that allowed their economy to develop to the point that now they have essentially a first world country, and there's no issue of their wages being lower than ours. In fact, oftentimes they're higher than ours. So, I want to encourage trade. I want to encourage openness. I'm not an absolutist in terms of blindly saying all free trade is good trade. So mildly free trade is probably, or maybe strongly free trade, however you want to phrase it.
Okay, I have a couple of worries.
Mildly regulated trade would be good.
Okay. I have a couple of worries there. One is that there is a tendency for us to export jobs, and if we export too many jobs, how are we going to carry on subsisting? And the article mentioned the export of American jobs to Mexico. Not particularly to the massive benefit of either side there. I do know that an awful lot of our heavy industry has effectively got exported to India and China, and one of the big reasons why it has got exported to India and China is that they have far weaker environmental legislation in both cases. So we are effectively encouraging the pollution of other bits of the planet, while we feel good about ourselves keeping our little corner in reasonable order. I am bothered about exporting pollution, and that sort of brings in one aspect of the recent set of trade agreements, Trans-Pacific Partnership and the TTIP with Europe. there is this mechanism in there for corporations to sue governments for doing things that the corporations think will reduce their profitability. And one of the major things there is environmental legislation. And I know corporations have had a go under existing trade agreements that way. I consider it unconscionable that companies should sue governments for legislation which is in the best interests of their population. Do you disagree, Elgin?
No, actually, I agree completely. One of the trends that I've seen happening more and more frequently here in the U.S. is the rather than politicians stand up and take the courageous move of actually taking a stand and passing a law, what they do is they pass a law so vague and they transfer the ability to sue to somebody else and let the courts do it for them. But they've locked the courts in, so it's sort of a cheap way of doing things. Now, we may end up on a particular policy. You and I may end up on the opposite side of what should happen, but I don't like the concept of moving this into the courts where it becomes vastly expensive and very undemocratic, because you're basically saying we don't want to handle this process in the democratic forum. We want to appoint a king, i.e. a judge, and let the king decide for us.
It also brings up, when you do that, when you go into a court system like that, now it's my expert versus your expert, and a lot of times the knowledge, the basic knowledge, gets lost in the back and forth of the attorneys. Can't recall, but I know I saw a couple things. It's bad science.
Yeah.
It sounds good, but it's bad science.
Well, let me give you an example here in the States. In California, they want to build a train from Los Angeles to San Francisco. I actually think that might be a nice idea. Actually, when I lived there, I actually thought my wife and I might take a holiday, go up to San Francisco one day on the train. We thought it might be fun. Found out there is no train that you can do that on. You end up getting part way, then you got to get on a bus in Fresno and go someplace else and then get back. It's a big hassle. So a high-speed train makes a lot of sense. They're proposing building one. It will never get built because it crosses too many areas where there are endangered species, and the lawyers, and it's going to be a boondoggle for lawyers where they can just milk that for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. But they've already spent $425 million, $450 million on it, and they've not laid a single inch of track, and they never will.
Yeah. Yeah. I have another worry about the increasing globalization, which I have to say seems to benefit large corporations wonderfully, and common people, even those in other countries, an awful lot less, which always worries me as a concept. I don't know if you've noticed, but we have finally come to the crunch point with cheap Chinese steel flooding global markets, where the current owner of most of our steel industry in this country wants to sell it off, and it's proving very difficult to find somebody to take it. We did actually have a nationalised steel industry at one point, because the post-war Labour government here thought that steel was a vital strategic resource and should be in the control of the state. We may have no steel industry here in the not too far distant future. How would you take it in the States if you had no steel industry, which of course would mean that you had no native supply of the basic raw material for an awful lot of armaments, for instance?
Someone else will
Yeah.
take it, or should I?
I don't think we have that. I think the United States steel industry is not as dominant as it once was.
True.
As far as armaments, there's actually other materials
Well, yeah.
that are dominate the manufacture of weapons.
Mm-hmm.
Steel is still probably heavy weapons. Still, steel is the case, but
I think the question for me, and I'm not really trying to answer your question, Chris. It's just not something in my wheelhouse here at this point. But the question that I have, I guess, is a question as I stand back a little bit and look at it, is to say, look, the economy is global. It is a global economy. That's not going to change. We're not going back. Globalization is a reality. Now, that doesn't mean, therefore, we don't think about how to make things better and benefit everybody that we can in the decisions we make, whether they're private sector or public sector. But I will say some of the things that I see here on our side of the pond, particularly, again, to go back to some persons who are Trump supporters, is somehow this idea that globalization is something we can somehow get rid of. We can somehow fix, and go back to the 1955. And so I guess I'm just asking, it's just an observation, is that in the midst of a globalized economy where these things are now happening, where we really are connected closely, and the left hand knows what the right hand is doing. In fact, the left hand can't do without what the right hand is doing. And how do we proceed from that context in the reality of globalization? And there is, I guess you could make the case, there is sort of a national security issue over certain things about certain countries being able to produce their own steel, for example. Even oil. I mean, we could have, I think the issue of crude oil production is a huge national security issue, and could potentially be a major problem. So I don't know. I'm just throwing this out as just some observation.
Well, the fun part was back when Kelly Johnson at Lockheed built the SR-71, and the whole design was steel and aluminum were not going to work in this plane. The SR-71, the Blackbird, is entirely made out of titanium. Now, the purpose of the plane was to fly 3 times the speed of sound over the Soviet Union so that it could not be shot down. It's important to know because the largest supplier of titanium at the time was the Soviet Union. Yes, that's right. So the CIA had to set up a couple dummy companies to buy the titanium, to ship it to Lockheed in California so they could make the plane, so they could fly over and find out where the other titanium supplies were.
Yeah.
It was slightly sarcastic, but that...
And hence the continued...
Go ahead, Alan.
I was just going to say, and hence the continued scripts that make Hollywood great in reference to producing action movies.
But what I was going to say about globalization, we have these free trade agreements, which is supposed to, as best as I can, and I'm even more of an amateur than Alan is on economics, supposed to equal out the trade problem. Well, at the same time, we're shipping jobs to Mexico. Ford has announced they're moving some plants down to Mexico. We've still got immigrants coming up here to find work. And that, I'm not saying that they shouldn't come, but it strikes me as we're shipping jobs to Mexico and we're outsourcing jobs, and yet we still have immigrants coming here. So what are they doing with those jobs that we're sending over there? There seems to be an imbalance in that, and that's what bothers me.
Yeah, you know what interests me, and it's just a question I threw out. I don't have an answer for it, but I just want to know, why is it that every president of the United States becomes a free trader once they're in office? Who would have thought in 2008 that Barack Obama would support the latest agreement, which many on the left are very upset about? The Republicans in the House certainly were supportive of it. I mean, I just think it's interesting that once a president gets into the White House, they seem to become much more open to the idea of free trade. Why is that? That's just the question.
Well, there's a lot of benefits to free trade in the sense that, just take, for example, Apple. How many people could afford an iPhone if it had to be manufactured in the States? When you support free trade, you're actually supporting a lot of goods and the jobs that come from those goods in this country, and that's sort of like you said. Some people are going to get hurt by it. Some people are going to get better by it. In general, if you have a good free trade system, the pluses strongly outweigh the negatives. I think, for example, a lot of economists are fairly agreed on the idea that Smoot-Hawley tariffs in 1929 were far more destructive and far more damaging to the world and it caused a depression than the stock market crash did. It was a reaction to it that caused a lot of the problems. And so to go against free trade, certainly you start having to put up trade barriers, and sure, people whose jobs get lost will celebrate because they now can keep those jobs, but on the other hand, the people who do a lot of exporting, their jobs will get caught. So it's not a one-sided deal. It's very much on the one hand, on the other hand. And in general, free trade causes a lot more benefits than trade wars do.
We may well see, harking back to what Allan said, the results of attempting to deglobalize, because I mentioned UKIP doing well in our last elections. That prompted the Conservatives to commit themselves to a referendum on whether we stayed part of Europe. So we are currently a member of the largest free trade bloc in the world, in the form of Europe, and after June, if the vote goes the wrong way, we may be trying to get out of that again. So watch this space, folks. I do hope that we don't vote that way, but it could be at least interesting to the economists to watch the fallout. I notice we've got past the halfway point. At about the halfway point, we tend to want to introduce any books that we have. So perhaps, Tony, you could start by mentioning yourself and anything you'd like to plug.
Not today.
Not today?
Yeah, we've been in the process of doing some family work and taking me away. Hopefully, springtime. With the springtime comes the rebirth of the writing effort.
Okay. Allan, how about you?
Allan, I'm doing great. Allan Bevere, and I'm an author for Elgin, and I have commentary on Colossians and Philemon from the Participatory Bible Study series that is coming out sometime, I'm guessing, shortly, within the next month or so, and that's my latest.
Excellent. I'll look forward to that. And Elgin.
Well, I'm Allan Hushbeck. I've written a number of books for Elgin, 2 on religion, 2 on politics, and my political books are Preserving Democracy, and the other is What is Wrong with Social Justice. I also do a bi-monthly or twice-a-month column for the Elgin Discussion Network.
Okay, and usefully, as you mentioned what's wrong with social justice and the Elgin Discussion Network, you recently had an item, Rich and Poor, on there, and I did have a blog post recently of my own which took a slightly contrary viewpoint. You were basically saying that property was a fundamental biblical value there, as I recall, Elgin.
I didn't directly state that in the blog post, but I certainly believe that. If you look at the 10th Commandment, it's kind of hard to make sense of the 10th Commandment without a concept of property.
Sure. I, of course, tried to make, as far as I could, the extreme case in the other direction. I think I started with a previous post really circulating around the love of money being the root of all evil. I moved on to land, which, as far as biblical principles were concerned, was more tribal than personal, and got returned at the Jubilee in any event. And then on to personal property, where I had a go at use value rather than ownership value. I am strongly of the opinion that we tend to be far too invested in things we think we own, and indeed, if you take the story of the rich young man who is taken aback when Jesus tells him to sell everything he owns and give it to the poor and then follow him. I know plenty of people who have significant land properties, and some who have significant collections of other things, who basically say they are more owned by what they theoretically own than the other way around. They're slaves to, I don't know, a farm or a landed estate or a collection of something. And so I see a sort of inverse of what's normally thought of as the moral of the rich young man's story. I see Jesus as giving him an opportunity to liberate himself from this over-attachment to possessions. What's your feeling?
Well, I think you can certainly have an over-attachment to material things. Mm-hmm. If your goal in life is to collect the greatest amount of toys, that's going to be a problem. On the other hand, some people have that problem. Other people collect a lot of things, but they use it for the public good. They use it for people's good. When they collect a lot of things, and then when they pass on, they turn it into a museum, which has happened to a number of the early American capitalists. You can go to their wealth that they accumulated, and it's basically been put into institutions and trusts where they basically are funding charitable organizations, or their houses are now museums that the public can visit. So it's really a matter of what you do with it, as opposed to that you have it. And I still have a problem with the idea that if you look at the Bible, you see God promised the land to Abraham. You see, there's an undercurrent throughout the entire Bible. It's just sort of assumed that private property is a good thing, and I think it is. I mean, when some of the early colonists came over to America and a number of colonies, they tried to set up these communal organizations where nobody owned anything and everybody could go into the storehouse and take what they wanted, and the end result was starvation and death. And then they started saying, okay, people can now have land that they could farm, and the result was those colonies succeeded. So sharing everything in common may be a beautiful idea, and maybe that's what we should do when we get to heaven, but I don't think it works at the moment.
This morning was listening to the news, and I don't know all the details, but the one person was complaining about the high taxes they were paying. They live on Long Island, so the median house is about $500,000. That's what they bought, and now they're complaining about the tax. Well, it goes to reason that if you're going to have well, whatever the cost of the house is, you know you're going to have to pay the taxes, and you know that there's a thing that goes with owning the property. You can't complain about the cost of owning the property that you chose to own. I would never, I can't imagine. I've never, growing up like I did, I could never imagine owning a house that had was a seven-figure house. I could never conceive of that.
I would take one possible exception. I don't know. To me, the issue is, I don't know that particular situation. I know in California, back in the 70s, they passed something called Prop 13 because of that exact problem. And the problem was people had bought houses, they had retired, they had set their fixed income out for the rest of their lives. And then what happened is because of the housing market in the 70s, 60s, and 70s in California, suddenly California was a great place to live. Lots of people came out there. And housing values went up, and taxes went up, and people were literally being thrown out of their retirement homes because suddenly their houses were worth more and than they had vastly paid for them, and now they could no longer afford the taxes on their income. So they passed Prop 13 such that when you move into a house in California, you get assessed your income tax or your property tax, and then that's the tax you will pay for as long as you live in that house, unless you do some significant remodeling that substantially changes the house.
Well,
now, I don't know the case in Long Island. How long ago did they buy the house? Did the house property go up to where now their home was no longer affordable because government taxes were impinging?
I was just listening to part of it because of what all we were doing today. But I know from when I started teaching high school, and I was teaching in Missouri teacher salaries are predicated on the property taxes of that locality. And I had to turn down a job one time because I turned it down for two reasons. One, it was a pay cut from graduate school, but it was a suburb of Kansas City. Now, the salary was based on the property of the area, which was all rural, but all the goods that you're buying were driven by Kansas City. It was a losing proposition for me.
Yeah.
And, and I always stopped and thought about it. I would like to have ended my high school teaching career in the Ozarks. But with the way everybody was moving into the Ozarks, it was impossible to even consider because of the inequities of how I would have been paid as a public school teacher.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Elgin, do I gather that you are very taken with the tragedy of the commons thinking? There was a book a little while ago that suggested more or less what you were saying, that common usage of things never worked.
I wouldn't say they never work. I would say they work in very small, controlled situations. But the larger the situation, one of the things that happens as groups get larger and larger is you get a built-in anonymity. I mean, you can't get away with things in your family because your family knows exactly what's going on. You get to your neighborhood, a lot of your neighbors know what's going on. But at some point, as the society gets bigger and bigger, you see this in cities. People there's an illusion of that you can do what you want because nobody knows who you are, that you don't have in a small town. It's sort of the Las Vegas effect. They talk about what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Mm-hmm. Well, the reason is people go to Vegas and they can act in ways that they wouldn't normally act, because if they act like that at home, everyone would know who they were. Mm-hmm. Well, as you get a society that gets bigger and bigger, the common thing begins to break down because there's a temptation in our human nature to take what other people have without having to work for it. This is why we're mad at the rich, because the rich are perceived as accumulating wealth on the hard work of other people. Mm-hmm. And what happens is everybody has that, and it's not just the rich that have a sinful nature. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And so at some point, the anonymity sets in, and you're able to go to the storehouse and get a little bit more than you put into it, or you don't feel like you have to work quite hard enough, and therefore the storehouse isn't suddenly filled because everybody ends up with, or a majority of people end up with the same sort of attitude. Whereas when you have your own ability to do work, then you get the return on that, and you see this. You saw this with the pilgrims in the United States. You see this even in Cuba now. For example, the Cuban economy they're allowing people to actually own businesses.
Mm-hmm.
One of the examples, one of the problems with people going to Cuba was the fact that you're bringing money into Cuba and people are working, but they're not getting the money because all the money goes up to the Castro brothers, who most of it goes into their bank accounts, and very little of it actually got back down to the people.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's changing a bit now, where the individuals in Cuba are actually able to have little small businesses. They're tightly controlled, and there's not a lot that they can do, but they're able to actually earn money now that they weren't able before. That's the dynamic of an economy that you don't get when you have shared economy.
Mm. I must say I was basically trying to put the other extreme position. What I tend to see is that the people who put the capital into a business take all the profits out of it. The wages of the people who actually produce things are seen as an inconvenience to be reduced as much as possible. Rather than,
I would have to say that's actually much more of a 19th century thinking, maybe early part of the 20th century. Nowadays, you're finding, and it's going to change with the type of labor, but I'm in management in a business. We're not looking to pay our people as little as possible. In fact, we earlier last year went through a pay increase just across the board to make sure we wouldn't lose people. Our focus is on how to motivate people, how to keep people in our jobs, because finding good people is very tough. All businesses these days struggle with finding good people. I heard of a person here who lays flooring, right? He hired a 19-year-old person with a kid, thought this person would be very motivated, gave him a job. The person showed up 4 days and then never showed up again.
Mm-hmm.
So,
let me just get back to the whole question, whether we're talking government or business or employer or employee. It really gets back to the moral fiber and the character of the individual. If you have somebody who owns a business, who is generous, who wants to be generous, who wants to, certainly obviously has to make a profit to stay in business, but wants to do his or her level best to treat the employees right and pay them what is right, you're going to have business owners who are going to feel completely different. My task is to get as much as I can and give away as little as I can. And the same thing with the employee. Am I willing to give my best and work hard for the wage that I am making? The government is it those in government concerned that things are right and fair, or are they more interested in perhaps because of their political ideology going after a certain person or a certain group of people, which often it seems to me in politics we just lump people together by either class or some other category. And by the way, I'm not making an argument against regulation and regulatory agencies. I'm simply making the point that ultimately even the law cannot do what good character will do. And that ultimately we're dealing with issues of character here. Now, I mean, I know some business owners who are people of high standing character. They want to treat their employees well. And that is a motivating factor for them. Now, there are others who are not that way.
I guess this is one of the problems I have with the attacks on capitalism is that they're attacks on the worst abuses. It's nothing inherent in the capitalistic system that says you must treat your workers badly or underpay them. You know, it's going to be large part in the ability of of the marketplace to adjust those wages. There's nothing, by the way, on the other hand, there's nothing that says that government must treat people wonderfully. We have numerous examples of bureaucrats and people in government treating the people very badly, or the point where, you know, rather than government working for the people, people are working for the government. Or as when Churchill once put it, you know, civil servants are oftentimes not servants, and they're not civil.
I take
Chris,
what.
If I may.
Sorry, yes, Tony.
The John Wesley quote comes to mind. You know, there's some people who, when they see Wesley, they think him somewhat tight with his money. He just budgeted everything he had. His statement was, earn as much as you can. He was never against anybody earning anything. But he said, save as much as you can and give away as much as you can. And of course, he laid out, much to the disconcernment of his wife, he figured out what it was going to take to live, and that's what he, you know, and everything else went, you know, to the poor and the needy. But that, you know, it strikes me, do what you got to do, earn a living, do what you like doing, but don't do it in such a way that other people suffer.
What I was going to say is that the model I'm hearing from Allan and Elgin is of the relatively small business where there is someone employing a few other people, which I will grant, where you have a benevolent boss, that works really, really well. But what I'm thinking of is the larger organization which tends to drive out that kind of business through economies of scale, where the whole thing is managed by bean counters who see paying employees more as an expense to be avoided. They see providing a quality product as something to be minimized because it costs more to produce, and things of that sort. It ends up being entirely driven by the economics of selling as little as possible for as much as possible, paying out as little as possible.
Yeah, the point is well taken, Chris. I find it interesting, by the way, that both conservatives and liberals are opposed to or are concerned about what's big. For the liberals, it's corporations. For conservatives, it's government. Both are concerned about what happens when the bigness of it reduces the institution's either desire or ability to be humane. So I just throw that out there. It's just interesting to me that just seems to be the same concern, but it's directed toward different entities.
I would also point out that, you know, for example, one of the prime examples of what you say, for example, Walmart. You know, they come in, they pay low wages, their quality is not all that good. But on the other hand, Walmart wouldn't be there if people didn't go and buy from them. And so in many respects, they're providing a service to people that who wouldn't normally be able to buy some of these products, are actually now able to buy products. If not, why do they go there? I mean, we get mad at big business for providing things inexpensively, and yet we turn around and go buy from them. You know, why don't we go to the store down the street that is, a little bit higher quality, a little bit higher product, and a little bit higher price? And we're essentially no different as individual buyers than the stores are on the other side. It's an equation where both sides are trying to get the best value for their dollar.
I think there's a spiral going on there, Elgin. If you drive down the wages, the only thing that people can afford to buy is the cheapest possible. which encourages the employer who cuts costs to the maximum, and it goes steadily downhill from there.
It doesn't go steadily, because one of the things I watch for an economy, for example, is as the economy begins to spiral down, if we're moving into a recession, so to speak, one of the things I notice is McDonald's and Walmart tend to do better. Suddenly people are going there. On the other hand, when we start coming out of a recession, McDonald's and Walmart tend to do not quite as well. And that's because people don't really want to go there unless they have to, because they would prefer going to the nicer place.
Yes.
But as you know, if things are tight, they will go there. If things are getting better, they tend to go other places.
Hey ho.
For the record, I don't go to Walmart.
Well, for the record, my view on Walmart is that you have to have a Walmart in a town that doesn't have a symphony, because where else do you go on a Friday night?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think it is kind of a vicious cycle, isn't it? Low wages, but then going to places that pay the low wages, the prices are lower. How do you work through that? I don't know. But it seems to be the case.
Well, you provide an economy where people can get good-paying jobs, but you don't do that by punishing employers.
You don't do it by punishing small employers. You might do it by punishing large employers who take the bean counting approach, drive down wages, and reserve all their profits to put in accounts in the Cayman Islands managed through a company in Panama, for instance.
It is an interesting question to ask, and I don't know the answer to this because I'm just thinking through it here.
Mm-hmm.
But knowing the profits of Walmart each year, what kind of a dent would it make if Walmart across the board decided to say raise everybody's hourly wage, just say $3 an hour? I mean, would that really put a Walmart into a problem? Or, I mean, I could see how a very small business could have a problem, but would a Walmart really even miss that? I mean, I don't know. I'm just asking the question. It's interesting to just look at the numbers.
If it's artificial, it would cause a problem. If it's built into the...
Say that again, I'm sorry.
If it's just done on an artificial basis, in other words, if the value isn't there, then it would cause a problem. If Walmart is needing to compete for workers, and to compete for their workers, they have to pay more to get them in, which is what I would like to see.
Right.
There won't be a problem because the economic value of the economy would support that. On the other hand, if you just pass that's why I avoid minimum wage laws, is because if you just mandate everyone get paid more, well, if you haven't introduced value into the system, then you're going to have, suddenly you'll have a series of jobs that don't actually provide the value that the wage now supports, which means those jobs effectively disappear. And instead of boosting everybody's wage, what you've done is you've taken a whole series of people and you've made them unemployed.
I haven't seen figures for Walmart, but I have seen a really quite decent analysis for one of the chains of coffee shops that indicated that paying their employees a reasonable wage would actually add a relatively trivial amount, pence, to the cost of their products. And generally speaking, I do not think the average consumer of their products would notice, but their employees most definitely did. I'd be very interested to see if that extended more generally. Me, I'll pay a little more for a better product, and I also will steadfastly avoid businesses that I know don't pay their workers adequately. But I'm able to at the moment. 10 years ago, I was absolutely broke, and I couldn't afford to do that. So There we go. Any final points as we have sort of slightly run past the hour mark?
No.
Nope. Well, thank you all, and hope to see at least some of you next week. In the meantime, have an excellent week and a good weekend.
Thank you.